When we talk about classical economic theory, specifically with macroeconomics, there's really two things we want to focus on. One is the classical dichotomy, is that there's real variables and nominal variables. Then there's monetary neutrality, which says that changes in money supply affect nominal variables, but not real variables. However, most economists believe that this classical theory describes the world in the long run, but not in the short run. And so what the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model does is it looks at how nominal changes might actually affect real variables in the short run. And so to do this, we're going to set up our model accordingly, where we're going to draw out our typical y and x-axis. On the y-axis, we have our price level. So this could be a measure of CPI or the GDP deflator. And this is a nominal variable. On the x-axis, we have our quantity of output, which you might think of as y, which is a real variable. And so we talk about our aggregate demand. The aggregate demand is going to be downward sloping like this. So here's our aggregate demand. Now the question is, why is the aggregate demand downward sloping? Well, it's trying to describe the relationship between the price level and the quantity of output. There are three explanations we can use to explain why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The first is the wealth effect. So if I am at this point right here, and that the price level of all goods and services, let's just say, is around $2, if the next day I wake up and the new price observed is $1, well, then I can increase the quantity of outputs that I can consume. And so I can purchase more. And so that would lead to a movement along the aggregate demand curve. So that's one reason why it's downward sloping. We can look at another reason why it might also be downward sloping. And the second reason is what we're going to call the interest rate effect. So if the price level decreases, then as a consumer, I could consume more, or maybe I don't want to consume more. I just want to consume the same amount I had before. But now I can take the extra money and put it into a bank to save it. Well, with more money in the bank, banks can now lend out more money. And with that increase in they're trying to lend out, it's actually going to drive interest rates down. With lower interest rates, firms will be more willing to invest, and therefore we'll see an increase in investment, which is also a reason why it's downward sloping. The third reason why is what we call the exchange rate effect. So if the price level decreases, well, I could invest in US bonds, but those interest rates are low, so I might be wanting to rather purchase foreign savings vehicles that might have a relatively higher interest rate. So by doing this, it's going to put more US dollars into the foreign exchange market, and therefore it's going to take more US dollars to buy foreign currency. This, as a result, makes buying foreign goods more expensive, so imports will decrease. It becomes cheaper for foreign countries to buy US goods, so exports would increase, and net exports would go up. So these are the three reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Now let's talk about what might cause a shift in aggregate demand, meaning what would actually cause the aggregate demand curve to shift, either left or right. Well, let's assume that one example might be that consumers' preferences or expectations might change. So if I expect the future to be more grim, or the future to be more uncertain, that might lead me to want to consume less today and save more for tomorrow. Well, then if I reduce my consumption, that would cause a specific shift left in the aggregate demand curve. So what might cause the aggregate demand curve to shift? Well, we might have changes in consumption. Well, you might think, well, if consumption changes and individuals then might be more willing to save money, then wouldn't that lower interest rates? And as a result, with lower interest rates, firms might invest more, and therefore the investment would take us right back to where we were before? Well, that is a possibility. However, if the firms are also uncertain about the future, they might be less willing to invest. So it might cause a small shift back. You might see an increase slightly in investment, but it wouldn't bring the aggregate demand curve all the way back. So overall, changes in consumption will lead to a decrease in the aggregate demand curve. Well, we might also think a second thing that might change aggregate demand would be changes in investment. Let's suppose a new technology comes out. Let's call it AI. Would firms be willing to borrow money and invest more in artificial intelligence technology? The answer is yes. Well, if this is the case, then this would cause an increase in the aggregate demand. And so that would cause a change in the aggregate demand. A third thing we might think about might change would be government spending. And this is the one we see the most, is the government can adopt a policy that will increase their spending. They might want to build more roads and such. That would also cause an increase in the aggregate demand. And then the fourth thing might be a change in net exports. So here's just an example. If we just are focusing on only aggregate demand, then if the US were to adopt a policy where they say, well, we're not just going to do tariffs, but we're not going to allow for any international trade. So no exports or imports. So in a sense, net exports would go to zero. Well, for the US, they would, because they have a trade deficit, which means they import more than they export, then this would actually cause a shift out in the aggregate demand. So this would be the new aggregate demand. But if we have a set amount of output, we're not letting the output change, then that would just take the price level and rise it up, causing inflation. So this is where we can look at specific things, where we can look at three things that explain why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and then four things that might cause the aggregate demand curve to shift.